The only stories that we allow our clients to tell are scars, no open wounds. If they're worried about you, it's the wrong story or you've told it the wrong way.
If you begin to kind of fall apart on stage or depersonalize, so you're not aware of your body anymore, you're feeling very much into your own world, into your own bubble, it's all about you, then the connection with the people in front of you is not there anymore. And that's not what speaking is about.
The mountain that people have climbed in their emotional and personal lives is almost never the most interesting story. The pebble in the shoe story is always better.
A handful of years ago, before I was working with either of you, Francisco, Joe, before any of us, we knew each other, but we weren't formally working together. I had somebody who was working with me on the TEDx Talks and the Conquer the Red Dot program. And they were an enigma because sometimes they would produce extraordinary TEDx Talks and they're just really successful. And those speakers have continued to be clients and gone on to great things. And other times it was just absolute, utter failure. It was abysmal. The scripts were terrible and the clients were unhappy and upset and they'd reach out to me and just, I'm having a terrible experience. What do I do? And it took me a while to figure out why this person was so hit or miss. And what eventually I realized was they had deep trauma in their own background. And so they related very, very well to people who had trauma in their background and found it very easy to work with those kind of stories and turn them into a compelling narrative and pull lessons out of them. But when they were working with somebody who either didn't have trauma in their background or did but had not fully worked through it in therapy or any professional context, they had very, very bad time. There would be times when they were working with somebody who had no trauma in their background, and they literally, I could see when I would watch back the sessions, when I would review their sessions, that they were trying to pull a story of trauma out of somebody who had none. And then in the times when somebody had trauma, but it hadn't been fully processed or worked through, they would reduce this person to tears and come to me celebrating like they had a breakthrough. And I was in shock, and I was just mortified. And I had to say to this person working for me at one point, I had to say to them, we are not therapists. You are not qualified to mess around with people's trauma, with their emotions. You have no idea. And they were very offended at me saying this because they were like, well, this is a breakthrough and they're accessing their emotions. And I was like, you have no idea what you just opened up and you are not capable or qualified. So we ended up with, I ended up preaching something that I'm not the first person to ever said this, but basically the only stories that we allow our clients to tell are scars, no open wounds, right? You can tell us a story that's a scar, but not an open wound. So we no longer work with that person for lots of reasons, including those. And ever since we've been working together, Francisco in particular on story, all the story has gotten much, much better and easier and more enjoyable, even when there are stories from trauma or darkness in the background. So with that framing, I'd love to hear, Francisco, from you, and then Joe from you in a different way, how you feel about working with traumatic stories or even just topics or ideas that are particularly heavy or dark.
So I guess that depends a lot on context, right? So the advice that, it's the same advice you just mentioned, I just call it something different, which is scars, not scabs, right? Don't pick at it. If you pick at it and they bleed, then you're not ready to tell. But it depends on where you are telling those stories. If you're telling the story at the moth, or you're telling the story in a very particular event for a specific set of people where that is what they are expecting, then you probably still shouldn't be telling stories about scabs or open wounds, but you can work with those stories. But for most other contexts, that is just the wrong story to tell. In the vast majority of contexts, to go very deep into something painful is not typically what the message requires. It's uncommon that on a TED Talk, some TED Talks will be about very difficult subjects. You had clients before I joined where they were talking about very difficult subjects, and that is perhaps the story that they need. but it might not even be the story that you need, because the one that's likely to reduce you or the audience to tears might just be heavier than it needs to be, because now they can focus on anything else. Yeah. So I think that there is a lot of emotion you can get across without going anywhere near that deep into the trauma that caused that emotion. But it's very context specific. For a TED Talk, for a keynote, I find it very unlikely that there's ever going to be a reason to go into a story that is that heavy and tell it in a way that is that heavy.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that real quick before, Joe, I know you have a lot to say on this topic from kind of the presence and performance point of view. The way I feel about it is basically, if you tell the story in this way, this story or in this way, is the audience going to worry if you're okay or not? If they're worried about you, it's the wrong story or you've told it the wrong way, because that is disrespectful to the audience. The audience is not your therapist. You are not there to, there are, like you said, the Moth, there, which is a storytelling, for those who don't know, it's this international storytelling nights, basically. There are, Toastmasters a little bit, Speaker Slam a little bit. There are contexts that are designed for people to kind of, quote, find their voice or kind of claim their story or own their power or whatever. Like something terrible has happened to you. There's a lot that can be gained from telling your story. But as a professional speaker or a professional communicator, if suddenly the audience is worried about you, are you okay in this moment, then you have taken them out of their ability to learn from you and from your story, to get a lesson, which is your job as a communicator. So that's kind of how I think about it. Joe, I'd love to hear I'm sure you've worked with this a lot.
Yeah. So first off, point number one, Brian, as you said, the audience is not the therapist. They did not consent to doing that work. And the question that I ask with speakers is, what is this doing for you? And that can tease open a lot around their motivation. Like, why do they really want to tell that story? Because if that sometimes is part of their processing, they're seeking that processing in the presence of someone else, and that can be an audience, then yeah, that's not the right reason to tell that story. The other thing is, on the topic of presence, when something like that is not processed, it's hard to remain present. We go into our own internal emotions, and there's something to say for cathartic experiences for the audience, right? Like the world's greatest tragedies have, lasted for millennia by now. They're great works of art. But is that what the audience is coming for? Because an art performance is something completely different from a keynote or a presentation or whatever else. So first of all, can you contain the emotion? I think if the experience has been processed and the person can contain the emotion, there's something valuable in being a guide for your audience, kind of walking them through the processing that you've already done, that you've learned from, and all of those things. And it's fine to shed a tear or two, so long as you're still able to look people in the eye as you do that. If you begin to kind of fall apart on stage, or depersonalize, so you're not aware of your body anymore, you're feeling very much into your own world, into your own bubble, it's all about you, then the connection with the people in front of you is not there anymore, and that's not what speaking is about. So that's where I come from it. And the key question is, what is this doing for you?
Yeah. Is there ever a time when, just your professional opinion, is there ever a time when there's a story, like I've had it happen, where there's a story that's in the client's life, a real story that happened to them, and it is it is the real life example that makes the point. It's the example. It's the story that will drive this message home. And the client doesn't want to tell it because they're like, it's too personal. I want to deliver this message, but I don't want to tell that story because it's about a person that's still in my life or that still is alive or that whatever. And I always have a tough moment there, which is you don't have to tell anything you don't want to tell. But if you can't tell that story, we're going to have a hard time finding a way. Like, then we're clinically making this point, right? We're losing the emotion of it. It's like, then they say, well, we could make up a story. You go, no, you can't. No, you can't. And so I mean, Joe, is there ever a time when you would feel like, is it ever okay to try to convince, I don't think I've ever done this, but is it ever okay to try to convince a client it's okay to tell this story and there's a way that we can do it that's respectful of the people? I feel like I actually have had that conversation a few times. I said, listen, if you believed that this was the right story and would be willing to tell it, if not for being worried about this one person, would you want to tell? And they go, yeah. I go, okay, so let's talk about how we can tell it without offending that person. Like, is there ever a time to try to convince a client that it is okay to tell that story?
So I will probe a little bit around that, and I'll want to see if the no is a no out of fear or a no out of, no, I really don't want this. So that's what makes the difference for me. If it's a no out of fear, like, oh, I'm worried about all, but I would like to put this story in, then we can have the conversation of how we can do that. And I have suggested, and I have done this at times where I've worked together with a therapist and the client. So kind of coaching and therapy working in tandem so that they can be able to handle that experience. And knowing the person that you were talking about earlier, I will say I have had that temptation sometimes to kind of dig in for the tears. And the reason I actually went and I did this coaching certification was because I felt that there was something there that I didn't fully grasp and that I needed more knowledge, first of all, and more tools to work with that. And in doing that program, I realized that that's actually not something I should be doing at all. So this is where I now would call a therapist in if the client really wants to make that effort. And if they say, no, I'm not interested in that at all, then we have to find another way.
So I have a hack for that.
A hack for that?
I had this conversation with a client of ours not that long ago, which is often the thing that they don't want to talk about, the story they don't want to tell, is almost certainly a bigger, deeper, heavier story. I very rarely go for big, deep, heavy stories for a keynote or a TED Talk because I think they're the wrong message to tell because they're not as relatable. So what I have said to this person in particular, I said, okay, so you don't want to tell the story about this thing your mom did, right? Okay, fine. Was there something, like that's the big thing. Was there something much smaller that would give us an idea of the relationship that is not the thing that you complained to her a million times in front of other people that she's doing that's annoying you? Is there something like that that is not the big thing? So we can get a feel for what that relationship was like. And almost always there is, right? And if a person says, I'm not, my mom or whoever doesn't come into my talk at all, that's fine. I'm not going to cross that line. But if I could talk about, like a snide comment, right? Yeah. And then there's ways to set it up so that you can convey something you're trying to convey without having to go to the big, heavy thing. The mountain that people have climbed in their emotional and personal lives is almost never the most interesting story. The pebble in the shoe story is always better.
Yeah.
Always more relatable,
I
always
love that.
lighter.
A moment in time, a snapshot.
Yeah, right. Because that's the, I don't need to, nobody wants to hear about the marathon that you ran. It's actually both sides of it, right? Because that's interesting that you just brought that up, because on the flip side, we actually do the same thing with the big stories. It's like you said, the big, exciting, the most monumental achievement, it's almost always unrelatable or very hard to make it not sound like you're just stroking your own ego or looking for applause. And on the flip side, the deepest, darkest, heaviest, we're all gonna sob together story is going to take everybody out of it. We're all going to be so wrecked emotionally that we can't actually get the point of this. Sometimes find the tragedy in much less tragic moments, right? The lowercase t trauma, the little example of it, can be more powerful, more impactful, because people can get it without falling apart, and then hear you deliver the point.
For sure. I mean, if you want to talk about like losing a partner, right?
Yeah.
Like you can talk about being next to them as they, I don't know, die from some disease, whatever, right? But to me, it's just way more powerful to just like say that, you know, I came home, I dropped my bag, and then I went into my room to say something to my wife, and I remember she wasn't there.
Yeah.
Like that is way more powerful than like being in the hospital holding her hand as she breathes her last.
Yeah.
Like that is just, that will feel manipulative even, because you're trying to get people to, where if you just give me what everyday life looks like now that you change this thing, right? That is way more powerful.
It's so embodied.
Because people are going to go, I can't put myself in the position of being in the hospital with whatever. I mean, I can imagine, but I've never been anywhere like that. I haven't lived that. But the whole, you come home and you want to share something with somebody and they're not there. Like you share stuff with people all the time. How would it feel if that person wasn't there? I think that's way more relatable. Going back to the point I made somewhere in this conversation or another conversation, the more relatable the stories are, the more people connect with them. And the smaller stories tend to be way more relatable than the big ones.
Everybody knows that feeling of losing someone, and then you want to call them and you can't.
Yeah.
Like that's something everybody can understand. Can I share an example around what it's like to use vocal variety or actually vocal unvariety to be able to hold a really heavy story? So I worked, this is years ago, I worked with a person here who was a volunteer for an organization in Denmark that sends people to spend time with people in hospital in their dying hours when they don't have family to be near them or they're far away or whatever. So there's a volunteer, they have 4-hour shifts, and they just sit next to these people who are in their final hours because they believe nobody should die alone. And this person, an elderly person, had seen, dozens, if not hundreds of people kind of breathing their last breath. Mm. So we thought, okay, how are we going to tell these stories? He had a number of them. We had like a collage type of talk without, everybody being overwhelmed and creeped out and all of those things. And what we decided we would do would be that he would just sit down, as he did in the hospital. And he would just tell these stories like they were the most matter-of-fact thing. Yeah. Like very little inflection. So he was really grounded physically and figuratively, and really kind of calmly walking us through those stories. And it was incredible. I mean, people gave a standing ovation, all of that stuff. Everybody was in tears, but not in a way that this was too much kind of way. They were just really moved. So that's, a way to do it as well.
A great example I've heard that connects some of these things we talked about is there is a storyteller I've learned a ton from, Matthew Dix, and one of the projects he has, I think this is in Connecticut, is he works with people who are the descendants of Holocaust survivors, and he helps them tell the stories of their relatives. And when he got involved with the project, what he said is, okay, I'm going to help you. He's doing it pro bono, and he says, but this is my rule. You're not going to tell anyone else's story. You're going to tell your story. And they're like, but I'm not the survivor, right? It was my grandfather, it was my mother, whatever. It's like, yeah, sure. But I'm not interested in you telling a story in third person because it's going to be boring as anything. And, So they talk about their relationship with that person and how that person was. And they would drop in like later, I found out many years later that the reason they did this thing that I thought was really weird when I was a kid was because of this thing that had happened when they were, in a concentration camp or something. So it's just, it's way more interesting as a story. And it also makes it easier, again, for people to relate to it. Because it's like, grandparents do weird things, right? And you don't know why they've done because we don't do a good enough job of asking, so it's like, how was growing up for you? Like, how did you get to the country? Like, whatever, right? And when you get that context, the fact that that context is the Holocaust is just much more powerful. But it's still a story about a kid relating to someone else that had a strange background compared to everyone else. And that's what we need to do. We need to find the relatable points in most stories. And even if you are, like, if you're the world's most famous singer, or if you are the president, right? No one is going to relate to that. But can they relate with how does the president take their kids to school, right? Like, how do you interact with your kids' teachers, right? Do you go into a parent-teacher meeting? Do you never go to those meetings? How does that work? I think that makes it a lot more interesting.